Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki Gustav, and I'm a Compliance and Student Protection Manager here at the Office for Students, and I'm here to welcome you to this webinar on protecting the interests of students. This event is designed to provide a bit of insight into the new Statement of Expectations and the accompanying insight brief we published on our research into the impact of industrial action on students. The slides, which John Blake, our Director of Free Access and Participation, will talk through, will last about 20 minutes, and so we will have plenty of time to answer your questions on the issues that arise before we are due to close at 4 p.m. However, before we begin, I want to outline some housekeeping points to help ensure that the session runs smoothly. So, captions. Please note that closed captions are available during the presentation and that these are produced live by Teams, and so there may be some discrepancies in the text that is displayed. Recording. We will be recording the presentation portion of this webinar, and this will be made available on the OFS website shortly. The question and answer session will not be recorded because we want to encourage as much active participation as possible. In terms of questions, please submit your questions via the question and answer box rather than the chat box. And this is because that chat box might not be monitored and we don't want to miss any questions that people ask. Feel free to submit your questions to us as they arise, even if that is while John is speaking, so that they're available there and when we get to that segment of the session. Where necessary, I will group similar questions together so we can cover as many questions as possible in the time that we have available. Just so that you're aware, when your name will be visible to other participants when you submit your questions into the question and answer box. However, I will not mention your name when I read this out later. If at any time during the webinar you need technical assistance, please email events@officeforstudents.org.uk and our events team will try and assist to support you so that you're able to join and participate in the event. I think that's all I wanted to say by way of welcome and introductions. And so for now, I'll hand over to my colleague, John.
Hello, and thank you very much, Nikki, and thank you everyone for joining us and giving up your time on what is, I think, in most of the country, a really beautiful day outside. So my name is John Blake, and I am our Director for Fair Access and Participation at the Office for Students, but I am significantly for this also the person who's been leading on key aspects of our refresh of our work on protecting the interests of students. So the purpose of today's presentation is to provide a comprehensive overview of the impact of industrial action on students as we see it, and the responses from institutions as reported in our recent insight brief researching the most recent widespread industrial action in 2023, and to summarise the regulatory expectations we have set in response to those circumstances. We're aiming here to ensure that students' interests are protected and that institutions are well prepared to handle any future disruptions by ensuring providers are clear about what our expectations are and how to meet our regulatory requirements in this space. We've also given over significant time to answer any questions, as Nikki was saying. We may not be able to get, well, we won't be able to get into specifics on any given case, but we will aim to answer as many of your questions as we can in the level of depth that we can. So do please put them in the Q&A chat box in the way that Nikki asked, and but we also have a couple of frequently asked questions to kick off the start of the Q&A session. So if people are thinking of them, you'll have a little time to do that. Okay, I'm just going to kick off then. So we've looked quite carefully at the cast list for this afternoon, recognise and value the level of seniority and expertise who've joined us today. So just wanted to talk about both what we're trying to do here and what we're not doing. So to be absolutely clear, we are not and have no intention of intervening in industrial disputes between institutions and their staff. It is clearly that is a matter for providers to work through with the relevant pay bodies, unions and staff members, and that there are a variety of different mechanisms for doing that across the sector. So aside from the fact that we wouldn't want to intervene in any event, it's also not a thing that is amenable to a single form of intervention. However, our role is rooted in protecting the interests of students at providers registered with us and ensuring they're treated fairly during their time in higher education. And in the course of the national widespread industrial action that we saw in 2023, we did see a significant amount of disruption for students. So UCEA, the University and Colleges Employers Agency, estimated that around 30,000 students were unable to graduate on time or were affected in some other way. As colleagues may be aware, the industrial action then received significant media and government attention. The Education Select Committee called for an inquiry on that, and particularly how that impacted students. And we felt it was only right that we think, therefore, about what our role ought to be in such a world, and in the event of a recurrence of such an action or similar action. To be clear, we do recognise that throughout the 2023 industrial action, and indeed in most forms of industrial action, providers are in a really challenging position in managing their responsibilities to both their staff and students. And we should say that the work that we are talking about here and the wider context in which we set this is one in which there was a lot of good work evident within the sector. So we don't feel here we are talking about or attempting to establish a standard that has never been set anywhere. There is good work out there in the sector, but the intelligence that we received was clear that that was not taking place everywhere, and that not all students could be confident their providers were acting with a due consideration for their interests, and that led to unfairness in the student experience across the sector. It's also worth saying that providers themselves have indicated to us that they would welcome further guidance from the OFS in this area, and that was a driver in us considering what work we would do here. As part of our wider work on refreshing our work on ensuring that we are able to understand, articulate and respond to students' interests, we've expanded our use of research, both qualitative and quantitative, and this was an example of an area where we commissioned research into the impact of industrial action on students, and you will have seen the outcome of that has been shared in our related insight brief, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. All of those strands of work combined together to put us towards a situation where we felt that the most appropriate regulatory instrument was to publish the insight brief and make clear what we had learnt, but also to set that aside a new regulatory statement of expectations regarding industrial action and the protection of students' interests in such a case. We don't think, and we know that this information is not, wildly revelatory or new, but we have sought to pull together information from across the regulatory piece to provide a list of expectations for providers in order to clarify our position and ensure providers understood our point of view. So I won't read through this slide in great detail, but these are the headline outcomes from our quantitative survey work and from our the focus group that we ran alongside that. I should say that although obviously these numbers are derived from that particular piece of insight work, this was consistent with other intelligence that we had received. So some have said we appear to have done one piece of work here. It's true that we've done one piece of work as part of a wider information gathering across the sector. And as I say, that's where the numbers are from, but this was consistent with what we had seen through other channels of information gathering. As well as the specifics there, and you can see that there is clear evidence that students were affected both on course, so in terms of what they actually received in terms of input in their education, but also on how that impacted their wider experience and their ongoing experience of the benefits of higher education, that there is evidence of a lack of comprehension of their consumer rights, particularly the right to request compensation where that's appropriate, and that essentially the thing that I think troubled us most consistently was how inconsistent the impact on different students, both within institutions and across institutions, was. And the key evidence there that around 46% reported they were offered some sort of alternative or compensation, but almost as many reported that they weren't offered anything. So lack of consistency both between and within institutions. And as I say, all of that matched very much with intelligence we had gathered from other sources. So again, I don't want to belabor all of these points, but I will just whiz through some of the key headlines that are in the Insight brief. So many students experience changes to their schedules, including cancelled lectures and reduced contact hours with lecturers. As a result, they felt unable to keep up with their coursework and maintain a consistent learning experience. We also saw evidence of significant delays in students receiving grades and feedback. So they were unable to make informed decisions about their studies, including choosing modules for the next academic year or applying for postgraduate programs. And there were clear effects on mental health and progression. So uncertainty is a key challenge for students. We know that from across all of the work we do. And this clearly enhanced that and led to increases in stress and anxiety amongst students. And that wasn't simply a matter of experience, but also active challenges for them in moving on to their next stage, because they were unable to progress to postgraduate study or employment opportunities without the outcomes that they had expected and had the right to expect that they would have in their hands. And the international students particularly were affected through changes related to visa status and applications. So both very, very real world experiences, but also a much wider pool of people who were very, very worried about those impacts. And we also found that institutional responses to the boycott varied really quite wildly. So some institutions had and implemented very effective contingency plans to minimize disruption, while clearly others were struggling to provide timely support and, where appropriate, compensation to students. Those that had robust contingency plans in place were able to move forward, and students reported being feeling that they understood what was happening and were involved. And we also saw clear and sensible usage of reallocating marking responsibilities, the hiring of additional staff where that was appropriate and within bounds of response to industrial action, and sensible, quality conscious extensions to deadlines for assessments. We also saw, and you will see in the qualitative aspect of the Insight brief, some experiences for students that were really very undesirable, including students being told that they didn't need to worry about a particular section of a course because they would just not be examined on it, despite that having been the reason they'd chosen to pursue that particular qualification in the first place. In terms of compensation and support measures, some institutions offered financial compensation to students affected by the boycott, but as I said before, that was inconsistent across the sector, leading to a perception of unfairness amongst students, both within and between institutions, and support service application was really varied. In terms of the quality of communications, the evidence suggests that was absolutely crucial in allowing students to feel confident even where they were experiencing disruption. So timely and regular updates, information from lecturers and staff was particularly well received. 78% of students expressed satisfaction with that source of communication. Those that didn't get the communication that they needed were the most likely to feel both disadvantaged materially and have experienced real stress. So citing a lack of detail, sporadic updates, a lack of acknowledgement of the personal implications of the boycott. So versions of things that we see in other occasions, but were particularly acute here. Students expressed a desire for clearer timelines and more personalized communication. Over half of student surveys reported delays in that their coursework was either not marked or marking was delayed. and again, points about uncertainty, stress, and mental health impacts, which of course we're all worried about for other reasons as well. And we also had evidence of students having to defer their studies for a year as a result, with all the corresponding consequences for their wider life and for their finances. Clearly, that had an effect on the quality of education. So missed teaching and learning opportunities. Students on practical courses we found were particularly affected, missing out on hands-on learning experiences that they felt crucial to their course. And students had real concerns that their qualifications had been devalued as a result. And as I say, only 30% of students surveyed were aware of their right to request financial compensation, and communication about redress and compensation was often lacking, leading to confusion and frustration amongst students, and that students felt that their rights as consumers were not being adequately protected. So we've set out clear expectations to ensure students' interests are protected during industrial action. Parts of these are firm restatements of things we said before. So to be clear, contractual terms and liabilities, providers must ensure that their contracts do not include terms that incorrectly limit liability to students during periods of industrial action. Providers should remove any such limitations and inform current and prospective students of those changes. That is something that we have asked before, and we have seen a fair amount of work on that from a number of institutions, but it has not been universal, and it remains a real priority to ensure that those contracts are fair and proper and in line with wider practice. We expect all providers should have effective contingency plans to minimize disruption to students during periods of industrial action, and that those contingency plans should prioritize the delivery of education and ensure that students receive teaching and timely feedback with as few changes as possible. So institutions should avoid leaping to a point of non-educational redress ahead of appropriate educational redress. That said, where contingency plans fail to deliver the teaching, assessment, or other promised aspects of student experience in an appropriate manner, or fail to recognise the difficulties they've experienced, then we think it is appropriate that providers make compensation to students. Across the whole process, students have a right and should be clearly communicated with, and they should not be left to navigate disruptions alone. And providers should continue to submit reportable events about industrial action to us in accordance with established regulatory requirements. There was a significant difference between institutions in which we were able to engage earlier as a result of notification than others. To be clear, all of these expectations set out requirements that already exist under consumer protection law. What will we do? So we are engaging with institutions and representative groups. We did so throughout the production of the statement, and this is obviously part of that engagement, and we will continue to engage with institutions to ensure their approach is consistent with our expectations, and we will consider regulatory action when necessary to ensure that students' rights are not compromised. But this is by no means a statement that we want to move to regulatory action. Of course, the purpose of a statement of expectations is to be clear what we want, to the point where we don't need to take more stringent enforcement action. And we will also share our insights and expectations with students. We made the decision to do that in the event of broader, wide-scale industrial action in the future, rather than share it at the point that we publish the statement, because we felt it was more likely students would be able to engage with it at that point. And we maintain a sort of watching brief to work out when would be the best time to share those details, although we have shared the statement with the National Union of Students and with student representatives. We will continue to monitor the impact of industrial action on students, and we will evaluate institutional responses. And as I say, we will take regulatory action where we think that's appropriate. Thanks for listening to that. At this point, we will move to the Q&A session. So just to reiterate, this section of the webinar will not be recorded, but we will endeavour to post a summary of the questions and responses following the webinar.